Imagine discovering that ancient physicians and philosophers had devoted centuries to studying the human nervous system not to heal pain and suffering, but to create a punishment so scientifically precise in its application of agony that it could activate every pain receptor in the human body simultaneously, while keeping the victim conscious and aware throughout an ordeal that would redefine everything they thought they knew about the limits of human endurance. What you're about to learn isn't just about historical cruelty, but about how some of humanity's most brilliant minds applied cutting-edge scientific knowledge to engineer a form of suffering so perfectly calibrated that it represented the absolute pinnacle of pain science. A punishment that combined advanced understanding of neurology, anatomy, chemistry, and psychology to create what ancient scholars called the perfect agony that could break human consciousness itself while leaving the body technically alive to experience every microsecond of its systematic destruction. The punishment known as poena cullae, or the sack, represented ancient Rome's most sophisticated application of scientific methodology to the problem of creating maximum human suffering through the systematic exploitation of every known principle of pain generation, fear response, and psychological breakdown. The victim would be sewn into a leather sack along with a carefully selected collection of live animals, typically a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey, each chosen for their specific ability to cause particular types of physical and psychological trauma when confined in a small space with a terrified human being. But this wasn't random cruelty. It was precisely engineered torture based on extensive research into how different types of pain could be combined and amplified to create suffering that transcended anything that could be achieved through conventional torture methods. The scientific principles behind the punishment drew on advanced understanding of how fear affects pain perception, how different animal behaviors could be predicted and exploited, and how the human mind responds to multiple simultaneous threats that create cascading psychological collapse. The neurological science behind this ultimate punishment reveals how ancient scholars had developed surprisingly sophisticated understanding of how the human nervous system processes pain signals, and how different types of stimuli could be combined to overwhelm the brain's ability to cope with sensory input. Roman physicians working with torture specialists had identified the concept of pain summation, the principle that multiple pain sources affecting different parts of the body simultaneously would create exponentially greater suffering than the simple addition of individual pain sources. They understood that the human brain has limited capacity for processing multiple pain signals, and that overwhelming this capacity would create a form of neurological chaos that could drive victims to complete mental breakdown while keeping their bodies functional enough to continue experiencing the torture. The animal selection for the sack was based on careful study of how different creatures would interact with human victims and with each other to create the maximum possible variety of simultaneous pain stimuli. The psychological research that informed the design of this ultimate punishment demonstrates how ancient scholars had developed remarkably advanced understanding of human fear responses and how terror could be weaponized to enhance physical pain while breaking down mental defenses that might provide psychological escape from torture. The confined space of the sack was calculated to trigger claustrophobic panic, while preventing any possibility of escape or defense, creating psychological conditions that would amplify every other aspect of the torture. The presence of multiple animals created an environment of unpredictable threats that would keep the victim in a constant state of terror and hypervigilance, preventing any possibility of psychological adaptation or acceptance that might reduce their suffering. The most sophisticated versions of the punishment incorporated understanding of how different phobias could be triggered simultaneously, with the animal selection being customized based on the victim's known fears and psychological vulnerabilities. The anatomical knowledge that guided the implementation of this punishment reveals how medical expertise had been perverted to ensure that victims would experience the maximum possible variety of physical trauma while remaining alive and conscious throughout their ordeal. Ancient physicians had mapped out every sensitive area of the human body and understood exactly how different types of animal attacks would affect these regions. Dog bites would target muscle and bone, while creating crushing injuries and potential infection. Snake bites would introduce neurotoxins that would cause systemic pain and paralysis. Rooster claws would create lacerating wounds and eye injuries, while monkey attacks would focus on sensitive areas like genitals and facial features. The combination was designed to ensure that no part of the victim's body would escape injury, while the variety of wounds would create complex interactions that would amplify overall pain levels. The chemical and biological aspects of the punishment incorporated sophisticated understanding of how animal-borne toxins, bacteria, and other biological agents could enhance the torture while creating additional layers of suffering that would continue long after the initial animal attacks had ended. Snake venoms were selected not for their lethality, but for their ability to cause maximum pain while avoiding immediate death, with different viper species being chosen based on the specific neurological and circulatory effects of their toxins. The confined environment of the sac was designed to concentrate animal waste products, creating toxic chemical conditions that would cause additional skin irritation, respiratory distress, and potential infections. The biological interactions between different animal species in the confined space would create additional stress factors that would affect both the animals and the human victim, leading to more aggressive animal behavior and enhanced torture effectiveness. The engineering and materials science behind the construction of the punishment sac reveals how even the container itself was designed according to scientific principles that would maximize the effectiveness of the torture while preventing escape or premature death. The leather was treated with specific chemicals that would affect its permeability and durability, ensuring that the sac would remain intact throughout the torture process, while allowing for controlled airflow that would keep the victim alive without providing comfort. The size and shape of the sac were calculated based on studies of human and animal movement patterns, creating just enough space for violent interaction while preventing any possibility of the victim gaining control over the animals or finding positions that might provide protection from attack. The sewing techniques used to seal the sac incorporated redundant security measures that would prevent any possibility of escape while ensuring that the torture could continue for maximum duration. The timing and environmental factors that governed the implementation of this ultimate punishment were based on scientific understanding of how external conditions could enhance or diminish the effectiveness of the torture, with careful consideration being given to factors such as temperature, humidity, lighting, and seasonal variations that might affect animal behavior or human endurance. Cold temperatures would make the animals more aggressive, while increasing the victim's sensitivity to pain, while warm conditions would accelerate the development of toxic chemical conditions within the sac. The punishment was often timed to coincide with specific animal breeding seasons when creatures would be naturally more aggressive, while environmental factors such as loud noises or bright lights were sometimes used to increase animal agitation and enhance the torture's effectiveness. The observational and measurement techniques developed to study the effectiveness of this punishment created some of history's first systematic approaches to pain research, with detailed documentation being maintained of victim responses, animal behaviors, and the interactions between different variables that affected torture outcomes. Roman scholars developed standardized methods for measuring pain levels based on victim vocalizations, physical responses, and psychological indicators, while they also studied how different combinations of animals would produce different types and intensities of suffering. This research was used to continuously refine and improve the punishment's effectiveness, with optimal animal combinations and environmental conditions being identified through empirical observation and systematic experimentation. The medical monitoring systems that were developed to ensure maximum torture duration reveal how healing knowledge had been completely corrupted to serve the goal of prolonging suffering rather than relieving it, with sophisticated techniques being employed to keep victims alive and conscious throughout extended periods of systematic torture. Physicians would monitor vital signs through external observation of the sack's movements and sounds, using their medical expertise to determine when intervention might be necessary to prevent premature death from shock or blood loss. Medical support included techniques for reviving unconscious victims and treating wounds that might interfere with continued torture, while specialized knowledge of antidotes and toxin management was used to prevent fatal poisoning that might end the punishment before optimal suffering levels had been achieved. The comparative analysis conducted by ancient scholars to optimize this punishment involved systematic studies of how different torture methods compared in terms of pain intensity, psychological impact, and duration of suffering, with the sack method being refined based on empirical comparison with other forms of extreme punishment. Research protocols were developed to test different animal combinations, sack sizes, environmental conditions, and timing factors, with the results being carefully documented and analyzed to identify the most effective configurations. This systematic approach to torture optimization represented some of history's earliest applications of experimental methodology to the problem of human suffering, demonstrating how scientific thinking could be applied to any goal regardless of moral considerations. The training and education programs developed for implementing this ultimate punishment created professional specializations that required extensive knowledge of animal behavior, human anatomy, psychological manipulation, and environmental management, with practitioners undergoing years of study to master the complex skills necessary for effective torture administration. Master practitioners had to understand the behavioral patterns of multiple animal species, the effects of different toxins and biological agents, the optimal timing for different phases of the torture, and the medical techniques necessary to maintain victim consciousness throughout the process. Professional development included ongoing research into new animal combinations, improved sack construction techniques, and enhanced methods for monitoring and controlling the torture process. The documentation and archival systems associated with this punishment created extensive records that provide disturbing insights into how systematic torture had become a form of institutional science with its own research methodologies, quality standards, and professional literature. Detailed case studies were maintained describing the outcomes of different punishment configurations, with analysis of factors that contributed to successful torture sessions and identification of problems that reduced effectiveness. Technical manuals provided step-by-step instructions for every aspect of the punishment, from animal selection and sack construction through environmental control and medical monitoring. Research papers were written describing innovations in torture technique and comparative analyses of different approaches to creating maximum human suffering. The legal and procedural frameworks that govern the implementation of this ultimate punishment reveal how sophisticated jurisprudence could provide institutional legitimacy for extreme cruelty while ensuring that the torture was conducted according to established protocols that would maximize its effectiveness while serving multiple legal and political purposes. Court procedures were developed for determining which criminals deserved this ultimate punishment, with specific criteria being established for crimes that warranted the most extreme suffering possible, Legal documentation requirements ensured that proper procedures were followed and that the torture was conducted according to professional standards that would make it legally defensible and politically effective. The international influence and reputation of this punishment made it a form of diplomatic weapon that could affect foreign relations and international behavior through the demonstration of willingness to inflict consequences so scientifically perfected that they transcended normal concepts of human cruelty. Foreign observers who witnessed or learned about the punishment often reported being traumatized by the realization that such systematic and scientific approaches to human suffering were possible, while the reputation for extreme cruelty that developed around this practice influenced international negotiations and trade relationships. The scientific sophistication of the punishment was often emphasized in diplomatic communications as evidence of advanced civilization and technological capability that should be respected and feared by potential enemies. The eventual abandonment of this ultimate punishment came not through moral awakening, but through practical recognition that its scientific sophistication and resource requirements made it economically and politically inefficient compared to simpler methods of execution and social control. The extensive knowledge, specialized equipment, and complex procedures required for effective implementation made each use of the punishment extremely expensive and time-consuming, while the international reputation for extreme cruelty began to create diplomatic problems that outweighed the domestic benefits. The decline of this scientifically perfected torture represents not humanitarian progress, but simply the replacement of one form of institutional cruelty with others that were more efficient and politically sustainable. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how this ultimate punishment reveals the extraordinary human capacity for applying scientific methodology and advanced knowledge to the problem of perfecting human suffering, demonstrating that intellectual sophistication and systematic research can be directed toward any goal, regardless of moral considerations. The fact that some of history's most brilliant minds could dedicate their careers to engineering perfect agony, while maintaining their sense of intellectual accomplishment and professional competence, shows how completely institutional authority and cultural values can override basic human empathy when societies prioritize abstract goals over individual welfare. This historical example serves as a powerful warning about the potential for scientific knowledge and institutional resources to serve systematic cruelty when moral constraints are abandoned in favor of technical optimization and instrumental reasoning. What do you think about this absolutely terrifying demonstration of how scientific methodology and advanced knowledge could be systematically applied to engineering perfect human suffering through the exploitation of neurological, psychological, and biological principles? Can you imagine the mindset of researchers who would dedicate their careers to studying pain science, not to relieve suffering, but to perfect torture, while maintaining their sense of intellectual achievement and professional legitimacy? The fact that this represented cutting-edge research and institutional science rather than primitive brutality really makes you wonder about the relationship between knowledge and wisdom, and whether intellectual advancement provides any guarantee against systematic cruelty when societies abandon moral constraints, doesn't it? Share your thoughts in the comments about how contemporary scientific research and institutional practices might be creating new forms of systematic suffering, while maintaining claims to professional legitimacy and social benefit. If you found this investigation into the scientific foundations of history's most systematically cruel punishment as disturbing and thought-provoking as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking revelations about how human knowledge and institutional authority can be corrupted to serve the darkest aspects of systematic cruelty. Ring that notification bell because our next deep dive will explore another historical example of how scientific expertise can be turned toward perfecting human suffering when societies prioritize technical optimization over moral responsibility. Trust me, these stories will change how you think about the relationship between scientific progress and human rights forever.